Brian Wilson is with us tonight. All right, Brian. This
Hello.
is Brian Wilson. You thought there was only one Brian Wilson, right? Brian C. Wilson. He is a professor of comparative religion at Western Michigan University. He has written this fantastic new book. I think I might have it right up here. There it is. If you could plug that one in, Kevin, from my computer. This is the book, John Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. There it is. And I think you all should have gotten complimentary copies or will be getting complimentary copies. This kind of just came together organically because I was really looking for a great panel. And there are actually 3 people who wrote in the same Venture Inward issue that I wrote in about founding mystics. Brian was in there, and Brian, I've had a chance to go ahead and read your book, and it's amazing, and I think you folks will find out that it's the same thing. So Brian Wilson joining us from Michigan tonight. Also on the panel tonight is Kathy Callahan, and Kathy, you know, this was a little quick interesting story here. I was, again, looking for just the right panelists. And I figured, well, Kathy looks like she would just fit this bill nicely. I wonder if we can bring her in by Zoom from Hawaii. And Kevin, today, she says, oh, she's going to be there. I said, great. Bring her in. Kathy has written a number of books on metaphysical topics and healing. She wrote a great article about 9-10 years ago on Benjamin Franklin. That caught my interest, and I said, okay, this looks like it's a good fit. And she does live in Hawaii. And one of my friends said, Kathy is military, and you'll probably figure that out in the first few minutes. So good to have Kathy with us tonight.
Thanks.
And Mitch Horowitz, of course, I've had the pleasure and the honor of interviewing many times. I've really conversation on radio a number of times. And Mitch, of course, his initial book on Occult America, but he's written on so many diverse esoteric topics, from Edgar Cayce, of course. He's talked about some of the writings of Norman Vincent Peale and the positive thinking movement, and his latest book deals with Manly Pete Hall, if I'm not mistaken, right? All right, so let's go ahead and start with the questioning, and I'm going to start with Mitch here, and Kevin, if you could just bring this question up on the screen for us, and here it is. There we go. You said, I gleaned one of your quotes from years ago, so this may seem like a gotcha question, but it's not quite that. You said this about Manly P. Hall, but you could have said it really about Cayce or others. You said, I believe his work may provide succor during this troubled and divisive period in American history. Although each generation believes that it lives on some kind of precipice, I have never before seen Americans angrier, more divided, and less possessed of confidence than I do right now. So my question to you, Mitch, and then anyone else on the panel can jump in. How does this polarization rectify itself? Is it gradual? Is there a flashpoint? And how does our spirituality work in all through that? It's not an easy question.
No. My conviction is that the polarization rectifies itself first and chiefly with the individual. I don't think there's any 5-point plan. I don't necessarily see any charismatic leader on the horizon who's going to lead us to cleaner, purer waters to drink from. I think, and I mean this very deeply and very personally and intimately, that each individual has to assume with a great deal of vigor some responsibility for restoring a sense of civic dialogue to our nation. And that means not participating in humiliation of people, not participating in the kind of gossip and sarcasm and hate-mongering that runs so wild in our digital culture, which is to say digital culture has become synonymous with the culture itself. And I think we have to renew within ourselves a sense of protection of the individual search for meaning. We are trapped in this mindset of calling something good or bad based on whether we like it or dislike it, which is the most rock bottom way of engaging with any idea. Looking at an idea or looking at an individual and asking ourselves internally, and usually very, very quickly, does what this individual believe, or does what this individual stand for match what I already have in me? And if so, I'm happy, and if not, I'm hostile. That's become our essential engagement with one another. It's not necessarily new, but digital culture has made it a lot more coarse, a lot more present, and I feel very strongly that individuals have to take responsibility for restoring a sense of
So the question then to you, Mitch, is,
unity.
and maybe I'll go to Brian with this, but Brian, if Mitch is right that we really do need to all individually move towards this goal of perhaps realizing that we are indeed brothers, that we are of one soul, if you will, whether you're conservative or liberal or you know, a CBN or an A.R.E. But how, again, does it rectify itself? What does it possibly look like? And you can give me a scale from, you know, the best to the worst. But is there a reckoning coming up? Because, and the reason I say that, I'm not trying to be baleful here. But in times past in our country, when we've had this kind of polarization, you know, you saw in what I raised earlier, the American Revolution, there was a flashpoint. Civil War, polarization, there was John Brown, there was a flashpoint. Some people say this is getting a little, it's not there yet, but we're getting a little close there. So Brian, my question to you is, other than the individual effort, which is absolutely germane and important, what does it look like, and maybe what's the best outcome here? Is there a reckoning coming?
Well, I think the best outcome is what you predict for 2050, which is a kind of total revolution, which I really appreciate, because for the last few months, we've of course heard from environmentalists that 2050 is going to be the kind of the environmental apocalypse. And I certainly hope that's not the case. So you're presenting a kind of more hopeful vision of the future, which I really appreciate. And I think we have to confront these things. But on the other hand, it's hard to have hope in face of the apocalypse. So a lot of it has to do with our rhetoric. We have to dial down the rhetoric. We have to basically get rid of the apocalyptic language. We have to think in terms of centuries instead of in you know, the next 5 years, the next 5-year plan. And I think that's the root. The interesting thing is John Fetzer was really taken by a story that was told in a newspaper in the 19th century. And this is the story of an angel coming to George Washington at Valley Forge. And according to this story, the angel predicted 3 trials. And it's pretty clear that the first trial, of course, for the nation was the Revolutionary War. The second trial was the Civil War. But who knew what the third trial would be? Now, everybody who reads that story is led to believe that it must be some kind of flashpoint. It must be some kind of apocalyptic event. But perhaps not. Perhaps we can work for something that's a smoother landing. And that's the kind of thing I would like to work for.
Brian brings up a story from the National Tribune in 1870, where General Sherman, who had fought at Valley Forge with Washington, purportedly told a journalist that Washington had an angelic vision at Valley Forge, and that America was going to face 3 great trials. But through all of those trials, and I think he said something like this, Brian, even as the dew falls from the heavens, even if the entire world is united against her, she will never fall. She will never fail, because of this spiritual connection to its destiny. Now, the story might be apocryphal, but Kathy, it still might be one of hope.
Always hope. There is always hope. I believe that. I know many people that I speak to ask the why. Why the polarization? Why do we have, you know, the 2 camps divided, these incidents we see in the news, things that maybe were whispered a couple generations ago or even 10 or 20 years ago are now said out loud in terms of vilifying a person who is different than you. And what I see here is not only the polarization, but I see on the individual level, as Mitch said, it provides the opportunity for those, maybe not in either camp, but for those in the middle, and I believe there are many more in the middle, who will at some point say, enough, enough. I'm not tolerating this from either side. And you know, an incident on the subway, a bystander steps in to stop it, someone who's bullying someone, maybe because they're, you know, dressed obviously as a Muslim, or whatever it may be, those few people that really do call the police because people are speaking Spanish, you know, in a restaurant in California, and they call and they report them thinking they're illegal immigrants and harass them. It's those people in the middle who maybe are not extreme on either side of the two poles who are going to say enough. And when enough of those individuals start to do that, then we may have a change.
What do you think that fundamentalists and evangelicals can teach those who are more mystically or metaphysically inclined today? And then we're going to flip it on its head as well. Brian, let's start with you first.
Well, I think one of the things they can teach is the value of the spiritual. I mean, committed Christians are very clear that it's the spiritual over the material. And I think it's that kind of fervency that can be a lesson. Now, the ways it's manifested, and of course there's hypocrisy on both sides, makes it difficult. But I think that's something, especially in our consumer society, that a lot of Americans can look to and take a lesson from. Not that they're going to become evangelical Christians, but they can really kind of reassess the role of spirituality in their own lives.
Mitch, Kathleen?
Well, you know, I admire first of all, I was very glad to see that you continued your pairing of Pat Robertson and Edgar Cayce, because it opens up a lot of interesting doors. And for years, I've admired the evangelist Oral Roberts, who's no longer on the scene. And I wrote an article, I've written about Oral in one of my books, One Simple Idea, and I wrote an article about his theology. And he was a very searching, profoundly serious man in many respects. Interesting incident a few years ago. There was a conservative spiritual journal that accepted an article from me very enthusiastically on the topic of Oral Roberts, where I sort of traced out his career and looked at Oral as a serious religious seeker and theologian. And everything was just delightful. They asked for a little bio blurb and a picture. I sent it to them, and then just dead silence. And I couldn't get anybody there to respond to me for weeks. And finally, it became clear to me that they were having some sort of internal war there and didn't want the piece. So I withdrew it, and I published it with Politico. And I was very disappointed in them, because my feeling was, and I hope there's a personal lesson here that we can all draw upon. My feeling was, can't there be just one New Ager with whom you have a dialogue, with whom you have a back and forth? You know, hold me up as an example of the wrong thing, a misguided guy, but at least let's have a discussion. And I was very disappointed that they would close down the discussion, and by all means, it happens all the time on the left too. And I feel that we just have to tear down some of these fences. There has to be room to have a conversation.
If I can parry off your Oral Roberts comment for a minute, because recently I just saw a great movie called Come Sunday. Has anyone seen it? Come Sunday? It is about an African-American preacher who was actually schooled by Oral Roberts, and he had an awakening. And he started to preach, and this is back in the 1980s or 90s. He starts to preach to evangelical community that there is no hell. Well, you can only imagine what happens, and that's what the entire movie is about. He is ostracized, he is kicked out. He had a 1,000-person sanctuary that was filled every Sunday, and even Oral Roberts came to him and said, "Son, you got to get right with God." So maybe, again, along with the lines of what I was talking about, Brian, does hell have a sell-by date?
Well, if you ask my students, I would say yes. Now, of course, hell has been an idea that's been tremendously powerful throughout the history of human beings, that threat. But I'm looking at the rising generation, and I just don't find that fear, even among the students of mine who are professing Christians. So I'd like to believe that this notion of hell and the guilt that goes along with it is a fading idea. Now, maybe that's just the Pollyanna in me, but I see it in my students.
Do you think that as we move more into this century, some of the ideas that I talked about tonight, the end of hell as we know it, the mystical Jesus, if there is a coming together, a convergence that's healthy, that is not a flashpoint, do we see evangelicals, fundamentalists, start moving in the direction of seeing that, well, maybe there is no hell, or maybe the mystical Jesus was a man to show us that he's the great example and not the great exception? Because you folks would probably agree that evangelical churches and traditional churches are probably not there yet. In fact, some are probably holding the line pretty hard. Is that the next step in this evolution? Or am I pontificating here?
It may be. I think of the traditional churches who, in the last generation, have moved away somewhat from that concept. You know, I remember
Of hell.
Of hell.
Got it.
When I'm not Catholic, but I lived in a very Catholic neighborhood. And, you know, I remember as a child these types of things, and you know, you're going to hell because of this, you're going to hell because of that. My grandparents, who were Catholic, could not come to my church to see me in any plays or events because they would go to hell if they stepped into a Lutheran church. That's changed. That's greatly changed. So I see not only in the traditional Catholic churches a movement away from that, you know, if you do this, you're going to pay. I also see it in some of the Protestant churches with, you don't get sermons on the fire and brimstone very much anymore. So what I think is if the traditional churches have made already some movement in that direction, although it may seem impossible, I don't think anything is impossible. And that some of the fundamentalists, the Pentecostals, may indeed start to maybe move a little bit away from that as well.
But Mitch, when it comes to Jesus as your Savior, that is a much higher threshold in the evangelical traditional Christian community. That's a pretty tall wall to climb.
It's a tall wall to climb, although I certainly wouldn't begrudge any individual his or her theology. You have belief systems within Judaism, Mormonism, Christian Science, and I have found the ability to speak to individuals, or sometimes fairly large numbers of individuals, within some of those congregations. For example, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which grew out of the burned-over district, William Miller, who himself was a product of some of the Great Awakening activity. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, or individuals within it, have been very good to me, hosting me on radio shows and writing about my books. And I was on a Seventh-day Adventist radio program about 5 months ago, and we were discussing some very controversial topics. And I don't think they're going to invite me to teach at their seminary anytime soon, but they were welcoming, and I appreciated that.
And they treated you well.
Very much so. We had serious discussions. You know.
Brian, you were going to say, it looked like you were going to comment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've written a couple of books, one on Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who of course was for a time the most famous Seventh-day Adventist in the world, who eventually left the tradition because his beliefs became more metaphysical, I can say. And then my latest book is on John Fetzer, who also spent considerable time in the tradition. And the interesting thing about Fetzer is when he left Seventh-day Adventism, he didn't leave with rancor. And he maintained very good ties with his friends who were Adventists. He went to an Adventist college, which is today Andrews University. And eventually they even turned around and gave him an honorary degree. So that, I think, is a really good example of how very conservative Christians, and in the case of Fetzer, a New Ager, can dialogue on multiple levels. It's possible. It just takes the will to do it.
You know, most of the people in this room have been exposed, obviously, to Cayce, to a lot of the aspects of the New Thought movement that I talked about earlier. And I talked about Freemasonry, and Unitarianism, and Deism, and Rosicrucianism, Quakerism. They don't show much up on the Richter scale these days. You know, it's not like you find a Unity Church in every town, forget every corner. Why do you think that is? If these are pillars of American mystical tradition, and we all think it's as great as sliced bread, why do we find, I mean, the churches even in our town, the 500, 1,000 seat churches are generally evangelical churches, fundamental churches. But Unitarianism, I think we've got, one in the entire Hampton Roads area. What's behind that, do you think? And do you think it might even change? Brian, jump in.
Well, I think the easy answer to that is metaphysicals tend to be not to be joiners, that they don't like institutions because institutions are constraining or potentially are constraining. And of course, this is a great disadvantage in the face of a tradition like evangelical Christianity, which has very strong institutional roots and instincts. So I think that's part of the problem. How do we get people together? How do we get people of a metaphysical disposition to talk to each other on a large scale, on a national scale? And part of the problem, I'll throw this out here, is that, one of the problems is the digital environment is so toxic. Is it salvageable? Can we actually use it, or can people of metaphysical disposition use it to basically be a voice of a different kind than what's out there now?
And you and I were talking a little earlier, Brian, earlier this week, we talked about one of the Pew Research polls that talk about, the largest growing designation in the spiritual firmament these days are the nuns, not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S, that people are not affiliated. And then, I might watch a Bill Maher or Richard Dawkins talk about this, and they say, see, the country's moving towards atheism. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But it's really not that, is it?
No. When they drill down, they ask people, what religion are you? And people say, well, none. And then when they drill down to find out what exactly that means, they find a very small percentage are people who are self-identified as atheist or even agnostic. And the vast majority of that group say they're spiritual but not religious, or some variation on that. So they do have a spiritual life. Sometimes it's quite active, sometimes it's a little bit shallow. But they still think of themselves as spiritual people, even if they don't join a church or a mosque or a synagogue.
Mm-hmm. What role do you think atheism is going to play in this so-called new age, in this 21st century? Obviously, regardless of what Brian and I see as, the nuns are not just all atheists or agnostics. Undeniably, atheism has grown. And, personally, that doesn't offend me. In fact, in some ways, I personally believe that atheism is very healthy. In some ways, I think it's the wolf outside the caribou pack. There are a couple of diseased caribou that need to go down. So, sorry. Spirituality, religion is spirituality codified, right? And it gets rings of stuff around it. And really, atheism at its very best, I think, tears down the artifice of religion and starts bringing it back to its, pure spiritual roots. So thank God, for the wolves, if you will. They're there to really, literally play a role. What do you guys think about atheism? And in other words, what role do you think it may be playing in the upcoming years?
I think in the past, atheism gets a bum rap. We think atheists don't believe in God, and that automatically brings up some images of negative things. Just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you're not a moral person. Maybe we'll be more recognized in role. Maybe I think most help America become more spiritual in a sense, as we move away from the religious doctrine and move more into spiritual principles.
Good point. Mitch, Brian, do you have a comment on that before we leave that subject?
Well, with regard to atheism, of course, there's the question of the searching individual who may come to the point of regarding him or herself as an atheist, and then there's the question of the intellectual structure and some of the kind of unofficial celebrity spokespeople for atheism. And it seems to me, I look at like Richard Dawkins, for example, and I don't single Richard out alone, there's other folk. And I think that what Richard has done is he has recreated a fundamentalist religious structure at almost every turn. You understand there's a difference between institutional and contemplative religion. To him would
one of the next frontier Python. You've got a winner there. And if you haven't done this yet, go to YouTube and just plug in Life After Death, John Cleese. Because to me, again, this seems to be another frontier. And parrying off of the atheism we were just discussing, because I would show this to an atheist and just say, hey, take a look at this, because it really seems to me that atheism, like scientific materialism, are almost on the same track, and those foundations are starting to fracture. So that when you look at what Dops is doing up at UVA, you're starting to see that their studies in near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, kids and reincarnation, all of a sudden we're thinking, maybe consciousness doesn't start with this between my ears, the cranium. Maybe consciousness, as I was saying in the talk before, is non-local. And if we start moving in that direction, Brian, might that not start pushing some atheists in a direction that maybe they don't even want to go?
Well, perhaps, especially with the authority of science behind it, because that seems to be one of the things that atheists are really promoting, is that they see, especially religion, not necessarily spirituality, but religion as a threat to science. So perhaps with that kind of imprimatur of science behind it, that will occur. The interesting thing about the spirituality today, well, especially, I mean, looking at my students again, is that it tends to be very fluid. And where people are today is probably not where they're going to be 10 years from now. So I wonder if atheism is an interesting place to be for a while. And it'll be interesting to see what happens down the road. Will the same people remain atheistic, or will they adopt a spiritual or a religious position? It's not at all fixed. And that's one of the, I think, the good things about the kind of religious spiritual environment of America today. It is fluid. People can change, and people do.
Any other comments on that before we move on to another subject? So what role, I didn't really have time to bring, because I was really looking at the more extreme ends of the two branches of American spiritual experience. But let's talk about some of those things in the middle. I look at the Black and the African American spiritual experience as truly unique in American history. And even today, it seems as though, although they have been, very progressive in some of their notions and moving forward, most of the Black churches, and Brian, we'll go to you first, and then we'll go down the panel, still seem to be more evangelically based. Are they still more or less ensconced in evangelicalism, or is there a shift? Where has Black spirituality come from? Where is it heading in the 21st century, do you think?
Well, evangelical Christianity has really formed the basis for kind of the solidity, the stability of a lot of African American communities over the last few centuries. And so I don't see that as changing anytime soon. It's something that's worked very well for African American communities. There are, of course, other voices out there. There are spiritualist churches that are African American. Of course, there's the Nation of Islam, which has a very interesting kind of esoteric current running through it. Mm-hmm. So there are counterexamples to this, but I would say most African Americans who are religious will probably, for the foreseeable future, remain committed evangelical Christians.
Mitch, I've raised this with you on a radio program, and one of my first questions to you years ago was, how does a nice Jewish boy from Queens, New York, get involved in metaphysics and esoteric matter, right? And of course, you gave a great answer. But, what about the Jewish American experience and spirituality? I know some folks who are Jewish get involved in Kabbalah, but as a movement, if you will, they haven't really moved in large numbers to the esoteric side of the ledger. There really isn't, or maybe you'll know something different. There really is not any kind of prominent mystical or metaphysical Jewish expression in this country right now. True or false?
Well, I do find among individuals, a person can be a traditional believer and might check off a certain box on the census form or on a Pew survey, but might also bring into his or her life all kinds of different practices, from meditation to yoga to acupuncture to energy medicine to macrobiotic eating, and wouldn't necessarily adopt a label and say, I'm a New Ager, or I'm into New Thought, or I'm this, or I'm that. But you start scanning people's bookshelves and you see, every third book is by Deepak Chopra, and they still would, view themselves as a Methodist or a Jew or right, what have you. So I do find that people will incorporate a whole vast network of teachings in their lives without necessarily abandoning the identity that they'll tell to the Pew researcher.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I know you said you grew up in a Catholic neighborhood, so you can't speak as a Catholic, but I'm also trying to see where in U.S. Catholicism or in international Catholicism there is that mystical end of things. Because as I raised in my talk, I really do believe, and I think Cayce and a lot of those in the New Thought movement, we're pointing towards the great oneness of all religions. And to me, at least, it's the great mystical traditions of those religions. So, you know, you have mystical Christianity, you have Sufism in Islam, you have Kabbalah in Judaism. In Catholicism, Brian, Kathy, do we see anything right now that appears to be moving in that more mystical direction? I mean, Carolyn Mace is a great example of a Catholic who just embraces the mysticism of the Catholic Church. And we often don't talk about the great mystics of the Catholic Church, but there they are.
I think we do have that. There are certain things that have made inroads within Catholicism. I actually explored something called centering prayer, which is practiced in Catholic churches. It's also spread outward. And that originated with Keating, who's a Catholic priest, quite some years ago. Centering prayer, if you look at it and you study it, is another name for meditation. Okay? And so you do have these groups. Now, they will not call it meditation, and I know the church I went to, a Catholic church, you know, they said, don't use the M word before I went there. Don't use the M word, it's centering prayer. But that's basically what it was. And so I do think you have that. And also, I think there's probably more interest in some of the Christian mystics among Catholics today who, you know, of course were Catholic because I was the only religion at that time. And it's there. It might be quiet. It might be hidden, but it is, the undercurrent is there and it'll probably continue to grow.
Right, Mitch, Thomas Merton, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen. I mean, you could go on and talk about the Catholic mystics. And I was raised Catholic, and I left the church at one point, but I can tell you in the years I was there, I never heard about those mystics.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm quite enamored of the mystical constitution of the church, and I have pointed out on radio and other places that as academic research into ESP and paranormal phenomena has taken a hit for the time being, the Catholic Church is actually one of the few institutions in modern life that dedicates tremendous research and integrity and scholarly effort to the investigation of miraculous claims. And I think these activities are undertaken with a great deal of meticulousness. And a lot of people don't know about it, but there's an extraordinary effort undertaken on the part of the church to investigate claims of the miraculous. And there's a whole vast variety of reasons for that. But the fact is, despite all the storms that are going on campuses where Centers for the Study of the Paranormal, or ESP, have taken budgetary hits, the church, in its own way, has continued that, and I'm very admiring of that.
Just a quick reminder, too, if you have any questions for our panel tonight, just raise your hand, give it to a volunteer. They'll bring it up to the front of the room here. Yeah, if there are any volunteers to pick those up, bring them up and hand them to one Valerie Jones. Hey, Kevin, throwing you a little curveball here, but that's what I like to do. I want to play a short video for you here. I think you folks are going to find this to be fairly interesting. This aired on CBN News, the 700 Club, just about 2 months ago. If you're ready for me, Kevin, I'm going to let it roll. Here goes, Kevin.
Earth's magnetic field is the basis for all modern navigation, from airplanes to satellites in space and ships at sea, even Google Maps and smartphones. If it continues to deteriorate, those systems and more are at risk. The Earth's magnetic north was moving even before it was discovered in 1831. It's a natural process driven by molten iron moving deep beneath the Earth's crust. But magnetic north is now moving so quickly that it forced the world's geomagnetism experts to update the world magnetic model a year early. If the Earth's magnetic field decays significantly, scientists say it could collapse altogether and flip polarity, changing magnetic north to south and south to north.
You mentioned about the desiccation thing. If it's really severe, if we lose the magnetic field, that we would be subject to solar flares that could dry up our oceans. Could you talk about that?
Well, again, as long as if we lose our magnetic field for a significant period of time, yeah, it would have catastrophic consequences for animal life on planet Earth. And it's one thing we notice is we got our strong dipole magnetic field just before God created the first animals. I mean, the timing was remarkable.
Oh my God, Pat's talking about pole shifts.
Was that a conference here?
See, Pat's talking from the stage again. He doesn't know it yet. But, you know, things like this, anything related to earth change, and we can bring Brian back in, how does that affect spiritual evolution in our country and around the world? Earth changes, pole shifts, what does that do to peoples and their spiritual evolution or de-evolution? Brian, we'll go with you first. You're on the hot seat.
Well, hopefully it gives people a sense of urgency. Now, there's nothing we can do about pole shifts if it occurs, but there are, global things occurring that we can do something about. So maybe it will kind of refocus our energies. I do think that, again, this kind of apocalyptic rhetoric is problematic because it's hard to have hope in the face of the apocalypse. So maybe it will actually reorient people to taking into account a greater part of in their spiritual life. But I'm afraid these kinds of things will just simply scare people into kind of paralysis.
And maybe even spiritually, they will, in an amygdala sense, they'll kind of, crunch down and hold tighter to what they believe. It will ratchet up fear, and that doesn't help anyone's evolution.
That's right. That's a problem.
I'm sorry, say that again, Brian?
That's right. I think it's a major problem. Even with something we can do something about climate change, there's such a great sense of helplessness in the face of just how monumental this is, that we see a lot of people just simply avoiding the topic altogether, which is not going to help anybody. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting question. How can we kind of reorient ourselves spiritually such that we can actually face these problems, at least the problems we as human beings can solve?
Comments? Earth changes? Spiritual evolution? Anything at all? We're starting to, I think pretty much the planet is getting the fact. There's still some deniers out there. But I think we're pretty much getting the message that Earth changes or climate change or global warming is upon us. And mass migration could certainly, a lot of people say that, some of the Earth changes taking place in Syria has actually, and in Africa, has actually encouraged, if you will, mass migration. And that can impact lots of things. We know it impacts the national discussion. Just wondering what impact it might have on our own spiritual evolution.
I'd just like to make a comment as an anthropologist that we know from the historical or geological record that environmental change of any kind is a driver in physical evolution. Now, whether it is a driver also in spiritual evolution, that's kind of an interesting question I haven't given a lot of thought to. But from what Brian said, I think you're going to have, again, a couple responses. The paralysis, yes. The fear, the crisis is here, and the person too afraid to do anything. And perhaps those will fall back to the more traditional religious beliefs or praying to God or whatever it might be. But it may also be an impetus for others to begin to look beyond, their own backyard and look at the world as a whole. And say, if we don't work together, okay, we're all going to be, going down with it.
True.
So,
my father used to raise an interesting point when I grew up in the 60s, and my dad was not a New Age waif. He was a chemical engineer. But growing up as a young kid, we had problems with Russia and China. And he said, there's only really one way this world is ever going to unite. And that's if we get attacked from outer space. Now, you heard the same thing growing up, right? Or something like it. Because the human ego, and I don't mean in the Freudian sense, but I mean, of course, in miracle sense or the Cayce sense, the human ego is about separation. It's about self-preservation. It's that, you and I are not one. We are not ultimately connected. And so it always has to create the other. So I think climate change is an evolution in one sense, because now the other is not another nation. Now the other that we've created is us. We've created, I think largely, created climate problems so that there is an ersatz enemy out there that we all need to unite, because if we don't unite, we're cooked. So as apparently, as opposed to maybe the English nation that said we better defeat the Germans, otherwise we're done for. In some ways, has climate change been something that we've almost created as a go-between between the heretofore known enemy, if you will, another nation, if you will, to something that we have created ourselves to see, we have met the enemy, and he is us. I've stumped the panel. There are no answers. It's the unanswerable question. Go ahead, Brian.
Interesting question, because did we somehow at some deep psychological level do this in order to set ourselves such a global task that it will force us to evolve spiritually? I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly a very compelling narrative, let's put it that way. It both acknowledges our own part in the problem, but it also basically points to the future that we might be able to solve it as well. So maybe that's the new myth for the 21st century that we need.
Mm-hmm. One presidential candidate said recently that the world needs America now more than ever, but only if America is her best self. What does that look like?
Being true to the ideals that this nation was founded on. Being true to the idea of brotherhood, universal brotherhood, social justice. That is how we're true to ourselves as a nation. Cayce obviously had that in a number of readings. But if we deviate from that and we go down the road of self or US before all, not only I think are we in danger, the whole world is in danger.
And I would add to that Thomas Jefferson, another founder who had deep sympathies for Unitarianism, and towards the end of his life said that were I to choose a religion, I probably would be a Unitarian. Jefferson made the observation that a real democracy could not be functional without an educated public, without an educated populace. And that's just profoundly important. And it's also very important for me to remember, as I say these words, that upon hearing that and agreeing with it, it's vital that we not jump in our imaginations to who the uneducated people are. We have seen the enemy and it is us. A point that I was going to make earlier, for example, is that I beg your pardon. That's my mother.
You can bring her in.
Yeah.
I want her to ask him a question, is really what I want.
I remember a few years ago, Rudolph Giuliani purposely allowed his phone to go off when he was speaking to a convention of the A.R.E, and it was his wife calling, and he thought it would seem folksy. I assure you I'm not trying to be cloying, I'm just forgetful.
I should have grabbed the phone. Go ahead.
But I'll take the call publicly. Apropos of this thread of being an educated public, one of the things that I've tried to do without a great deal of success is point out to people in mainstream journalism and mainstream academia that you have to stop this caricaturing of the prosperity gospel or other reaches of organized religion that you don't like. I look at all the figures on television who I personally like John Oliver and Rachel Maddow and Bill Maher, and every 3 months or so, the wheel turns around to the prosperity gospel, and they depict it in the most cartoonish, broad-stroke terms that are terms that they would correctly identify as terms of bigotry if it were being directed from the other side. So when we talk about the importance of having an educated public, don't just think that it's, Uncle Mike, the loudmouth at Thanksgiving. Look in your own house and ask where that has to be done.
Yeah. You know, I've been reading some of Brian Wilson's book on John Fetzer, and you're in for a good read, folks. And I knew John Fetzer was an industrial magnate. He was a broadcasting giant. He owned the Detroit Tigers. I had no idea, Brian, that he had such a rich spiritual heritage, starting with something conventional, but then moving into spiritualism, theosophy. He engaged the Cayce readings. And here's my question for you, Brian. He was one of the first students of A Course in Miracles. What role does the Course in Miracles play in our spiritual evolution today?
Well, it's been called the kind of Bible of the New Age. And for people who want a kind of comprehensive entree into a metaphysical worldview, I couldn't recommend more highly A Course in Miracles. So I think the ideas are all there. And for people who want a kind of, as I said, an introduction, a way into it. Now, John Fetzer was one of the first people who read A Course in Miracles after it was published, and found it just tremendously useful for him. And the interesting thing was that he basically found it useful because it confirmed a lot of the things that he was exploring in other traditions. And so while he never gave up A Course in Miracles, it was a way of kind of connecting the dots for him and for going forward as well. He always continued reading the Course. He had A Course in Miracle groups that he was involved in. But it was also a jumping off point for him too. And it led him into the exploration of a lot of different things.
That was it was rather late in his life though, wasn't it, Brian?
He died in 1991, and
Yeah.
he first encountered A Course, I think it was 75 or 76. I forget exactly the date.
Oh, okay. It was that early. All right.
Yes.
So it wasn't quite that early towards the end of his life. Course in
No.
Miracles. Thoughts?
I feel it's been just seismically important. I agree entirely with Brian's assessment. And of course, we currently have a presidential candidate, Marianne Williamson, who came up through the Course, and she is going to be included in the first two of the Democratic presidential debates. I am constantly struck by the inroads that the Course has made into mainstream life. Again, I find people from Catholic backgrounds, Jewish backgrounds, who are reading A Course in Miracles, and people have personally professed to me the depth of change that it has worked in their life, or the benefits that they've gotten from one of the interpretive books, like Gerald Jampolsky's Love is Letting Go of Fear. But if you ask them, what are you about, what box do you check, they would say Catholic or Jewish or what have you. And yet the Course has been a profound part of their lives.
Any comments on the Course?
Yeah, the Course. I mentioned earlier today that you don't read the Course. If you read the Course, you're not really doing it. You work the Course. And it is difficult. It is very difficult. And I think a lot of people give up on it, maybe come back to it. And I think it's underrated, the importance, the impact. And I see that I have to say, I see it a lot among A.R.E. people, because we tend to look at the readings as the quote gospel. But I found the Course a great complement to the readings, and it helped me interpret some of the readings a little bit differently. And I think that in the future, we're going to look back, people will look back, and perhaps realize the true impact that it is going to have or is having.
Gotcha. We're going to answer some of your questions here in just a second. I've got one more question for my panel tonight. So, Edgar Cayce, many of you know, had a dream where he had just come back from Detroit. He was arrested in Detroit for practicing medicine, spent 2 or 3 days in jail. He's on his way back and he's bereft, depressed. And so he has a dream. And in the dream, he is shown that he returns to the United States in 2158, 22nd century. And he's in Nebraska, which is oceanfront. And in the dream, he's a young child, and he's trying to tell these professorial types that he was Edgar Cayce in a past lifetime. So they take him up in a cigar-shaped ship. That's actually in his dream, long before UFOs became a thing here in this country. And they take him to Virginia Beach, which is, as his reading said, is still very much here. And they discover some of his readings. And he came out of this and he tried to interpret it himself, but he actually went to his source and got a reading on his dream. And the reading told him two things. Number one, that there would be a future, and that number two, his works would be remembered. So now I don't think Cayce had an ego per se, or not much of an ego. I don't think he would care if he was remembered 100 years henceforth as, a very stable genius. But I think he wanted to know whether his works would survive. How will Cayce be remembered 100 or 200 years from now? Will he be remembered as big or as not as large as a Jerry Falwell or a Billy Graham or a Pat Robertson? What does it look like in 100 or 200 years, the legacy of Edgar Cayce, or is he just a small footnote in the history of humankind? Let's go around the panel and then we'll take your questions. Brian, you first. What do you think?
Well, he's had a tremendous impact, especially with certain themes and issues, Atlantis, past lives, earth changes, those kinds of things. But I think he'll actually be remembered for his readings on energy medicine and alternative health. And I think as we move on and the therapeutic becomes more important, both spiritually, psychologically, and physically, the kinds of connections that Edgar Cayce was talking about will become more and more important. So I think if he's remembered in the future, it'll be for that.
Kathy.
I certainly agree with Brian that he will be remembered as the father of holistic medicine, but I also would like to think that he will be remembered as a prophet of the work with a capital W, and that work has been ongoing for over 10, 12,000 years, dating back to the time of the sinking of Atlantis, the Rata story, when they tried to establish a nation based on the ideals that this nation is established on. And of course, my favorite, Ben Franklin, had readings from Cayce, and he was the elder pharaoh in the Rata story, the father of Hewlin Cayce as the younger pharaoh.
And that was a man named Franklin in this lifetime,
Yeah,
right?
Frank-
When he came to Cayce, that was his name.
Franklin Bradley.
Right.
Really, Franklin Bradley was his name in this lifetime. So the way I see it is this work has been ongoing a very long time. They tried it way back when. They tried it again during the American Revolution. And he came back again, a third, many times I'm sure, but the one that we know about as Franklin Bradley. And he was a board member here on the precursor to the A.R.E., the Association of National Investigators. And he contributed a great deal to the early days of the A.R.E. And so I just see this as a continuation of the work over thousands of years. And I'd like to think that Edgar Cayce will be remembered as a prophet of someone who continued that work and pushed it forward.
Very good. Mitch, your ideas, your thoughts.
I'll just say briefly, I was struck that the slides that you put up of all the pioneers of the New Age, Madame Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, Manly Hall, Edgar Cayce, others among them, are being more widely read today, even discounting for population growth, than they were during their lifetime. It's absolutely extraordinary. Given some of the criticisms that were made of Madame Blavatsky, for example, during her lifetime, you would have had reason to think that she would just be considered some weird Victorian footnote and look what these poor people were into, and yet she's more widely known today, if anything, than she was during her lifetime.
All right, guys, stick around. I want to thank Brian, Kathy, and Mitch. Let's give a hand to this great panel that I had tonight. Amazing. Okay. All right, here we go with some of your questions, folks. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and give it to Valerie? Here we go. What rules or what roles does public education play in maintaining the status quo? I'm not sure if that's the status quo of where we are intellectually, where we are metaphysically. Anybody want to jump in and jump at that one?
I certainly hope not. I think the purpose of education is really to promote, among other things, individual growth, both spiritually, psychologically, and in other ways as well. So the idea that a good education is simply going to maintain the status quo, I think, is a kind of what's the word I'm groping for? It would be a kind of treason against the reason for education. So I would hope not.
Edgar often used the term creative forces to refer to God. Yet the Abrahamic God in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is rather anthropomorphic. Was Edgar's view of God, not his source's view, but his view of God, more mystical or more conventional? Kathy, I'm going to you first.
I knew you'd come here. In Hebrew theology, there are many names for God. The one we may hear about most is the anthropomorphic type. Jehovah comes to mind. But there were many more names for God in the Old Testament and the Torah. El Shaddai, the magnificent, mighty-breasted one, female people. Elohim. Elohim is a plural form of the creative God, the creator God, and that is the God, the Elohim, is mentioned in Genesis. Adonai, which is, many people have heard of Adonai, I think, maybe not as much as Jehovah, but Adonai is a plural form, my lords. So when you actually delve into, Jewish theology, you will see that God, took many forms, many names, many aspects, and not just the Jehovah, the older, white bearded man that we may popularly think of.
Thank you. Any other comments? Mitch, Brian? All right, let's go on to our next question. This is for Mitch. How do you reconcile the idea that you presented that we are God, the creator, not the created, when the Cayce readings clearly say that God created all souls when he said, "Let there be light"? If we claim we are the first cause, does that give license to do whatever we want without accountability? Basically, a Luciferian hypnotic concept. Hedonistic concept, sorry.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting question. First of all, I do believe in cosmic reciprocity. I do believe in the oneness of all existence. Some people would use the term karma, and that whatever the individual enacts within this sphere of existence is ultimately reciprocal and is coming back to that person. I certainly have a very deeply wrought code of ethics that's come out of years and years of the search. And my primary code is one of nonviolence. I don't mean physical nonviolence per se, or an abstention from self-defense. I mean not doing anything to violate another individual's capacity to live out and to fulfill his or her highest potential. I feel very, very strongly about that. So I drink from many different wells, and I believe very strongly in a commonality, ultimately, of life, and that the individual finds him or herself within a complex that's completely reciprocal. And that's one of the primary places from which my ethics arise.
All right, very good, thank you. Along the question or the topic when we were discussing African American spirituality, what is your opinion, this is for the entire panel, of Martin Luther King and metaphysics? Some question it as it relates to, I'm not sure who this is, James Cone, C-O-N-E. How does peace resistance relate to metaphysics? Brian, let's go to you first.
Well, James Cone was a very famous pioneer of Black theology, which is the idea that you read the Bible and you construct theology through the lens of the Black experience. So he had a kind of, Martin Luther King really had a formative influence on Cone and other Black theologians. And I think the metaphysical part of King's message is the ethical part. He talked about the arc of arc of justice. And if we think of that in metaphysical terms, it's set. The universe does have a kind of justice built into it, and if we work towards it and put ourselves spiritually in line with it, it will be achieved. So I think there is a kind of metaphysical reading of Martin Luther King, although I'm not sure anybody's actually done it explicitly.
All right, go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that, that there is a family lineage, a family tree of connection between King and Theosophy. And I write about this in Occult America, and it's very commonly overlooked by mainstream historians because they just are not looking in the right places. Mahatma Gandhi made statements several times in his letters, interviews, journal articles, that it was Madame H.P. Blavatsky, who he met in London toward the end of her life, who first ignited his own ideal of universal brotherhood. And it was Gandhi who provided King with his first sensibility that the path of nonviolence could be an actual political program, because King, as a young man, was wrestling terribly with the question of how to remain true to his ministerial calling, how to remain true to his Christian pulpit, but also to encourage rebellion. When he's reading from the Beatitudes, you know, blessed are the poor in spirit, and the meek shall inherit the earth. And he's asking, how do I translate this into a program of radical non-cooperation with a corrupt system? It was Gandhi who provided the bridge. Gandhi provided King with the bridge. And Gandhi credited quite vocally and plainly Madame Blavatsky with first instigating the idea of universal brotherhood. So there's an enormous hole to all this.
Wow, a nexus really between Blavatsky all the way through to King.
It's there.
I didn't raise this in my talk earlier tonight, but thankfully someone else has, so here we go. So what about extraterrestrials? How is that a catalyst for the new awakening? Well, that's an easy one, Brian. I know you have the answer, and then Kathy does too.
Well, I could say the interesting thing is John Fetzer was a true believer in the reality of UFOs. And I think it fit very well with his metaphysical worldview, because he just saw the universe is populated with consciousnesses throughout, and it would be very surprising if they didn't engage with humanity. So for a person like John Fetzer, who believed in the reality of extraterrestrials, he really thought they were already engaged in the spiritual evolution of humanity.
Any other comments? Let's move on. We've got a couple more questions, and then we'll let you folks get to your next rounds here. I'm going to put two questions together because I kind of think they fit, and for Mitch and the entire panel. Did Edgar Cayce and Neville Goddard know each other? Did they ever meet? And also, did Cayce ever meet Ernest Holmes? Their teachings use the same vocabulary and teach the same spiritual ideas. Mitch, we'll start with you. Seems like a natural.
I appreciate that question. I've never come upon any evidence that Edgar Cayce and Neville Goddard met, but they were aware of one another to the extent that there is a book up in the library that Neville personally autographed to Edgar Cayce. I'm not aware of Cayce and Ernest Holmes ever having met, but you know, one has to remember Edgar's fame only really began to build in earnest, you know, towards that latter portion of his life, and they were occupying different places geographically. I'm sure that they were aware of one another. I have no question of that. In fact, I'm continually struck at how profoundly Edgar was aware of different people in the spiritual culture, the alternative spiritual culture. Mark Thurston exposed me to the fact that Edgar Cayce recommended the work of the mystic and mathematician P.D. Uspensky, who was a disciple of Gurdjieff's, for parallel study. And I was really surprised and delighted by that. So Edgar's awareness of the world around him was quite vast, but I'm not aware personally of any collaboration or meetings among those figures.
Mitch, you stated that nobody has survived death. Does this not negate the resurrection of Jesus and Cayce's The Pattern and the Savior and the Christ, the power? How can there be reciprocity if there is no eternal life?
Right. Well, I was speaking strictly of physical existence on this particular realm. In fact, when I was making the point in my book, The Miracle Club, that there has been no instance of immortality, I actually turned to a conservative Christian theologian, and I said to him, would I be violating your sense of theology by making this point? And he said, no, you wouldn't, because Christ did undergo physical demise and the resurrection was a spiritual resurrection. So that's my contention in terms of this realm of existence.
Do you think that, I was talking a little bit tonight about, again, evangelical Christianity and the metaphysical root of the nation, and yet we know that there has been some co-opting over the many decades, if not centuries. And I think of Norman Vincent Peale, who I know you've written extensively on, Mitch, and Joel Osteen. You told a very interesting story once about how Norman Vincent Peale, again, talked about the power of positive thinking, and when they asked him what was the root cause of his philosophy, he always talked about Jesus and went to the Bible, as does Joel Osteen. He told me a really interesting story that towards the end of his life, Norman Vincent Peale said, yeah, I kind of did dabble in Ernest Holmes and religious science.
Oh, yeah.
So there was some truth to that.
Yes, Peale was very concerned about making political statements, and he had gotten himself into tremendous controversies for speaking about politics, and his political opinions could run in extreme directions, and he was very cognizant of that later in life and very averse to controversies. But he did talk specifically about receiving influences from Ernest Holmes, from Unity, from Christian Science, and from other branches of the new metaphysics. And I have to hand it to Joel Osteen. People sometimes make fun of him and they feel that he's too milquetoast and what have you, but Joel is one of the very only evangelical ministers who has ever consented to appear on the cover of Guideposts, which is the magazine Norman Vincent Peale founded. And Joel will cite Norman Vincent Peale as a source of influence. And to most evangelicals, Norman Vincent Peale is considered a very squishy, weird figure. He's considered liberal and theologically. He's considered suspect, because there is some knowledge and understanding that Peale was drawing upon New Age sources. And Osteen is one of the very few evangelical ministers who will directly cite Peale as an influence, which I think is an act of honesty, and I appreciate it.
Brian, any comments here before we wrap this up? Anything about, in fact, let me throw this too, because maybe this is a good segue, and then we're really done at this point. Among evangelicals, how big is the movement and how powerful to bring about, let me read this, see if I've got it. Among evangelicals, how big is the movement and how powerful is it to bring about the crisis of the Dome of the Rock war in the Middle East, Armageddon? So let's see if we can bridge the gap there between some evangelical thinking that does borrow from New Thought to something that is much more fundamental and may actually lead us into a crisis.
Well, I know there are voices out there who would like to kind of take a hand in fulfilling prophecy. I just don't know how widespread that is. Quite frankly, personally, I wouldn't be too worried about it. There's an interesting, through the power of prayer, which is a kind of positive thinking, I guess, it kind of shares some of the aspects of New Thought. But as a movement in the United States, I think it's more of a curiosity than it is a real threat.
Mm-hmm. And this final question. Pope Francis says he does not believe in hell. What do you think, Kathleen? What does that tell us, Dr. Callahan, about our future?
I talked about Pope Francis this afternoon. And again, not a Catholic, but I think that this Pope knows a lot that he doesn't say. I think that he's not the only clergy in the Catholic Church or other religions who sometimes have a great deal of knowledge, but they have, for whatever reasons, chosen to work within the framework of conventional religion. I think nothing happens by accident, and Pope Francis is probably here at this time to try as best he can to make inroads in some of the Catholic doctrines. And he's made some changes. He's come out, I don't know that particular statement, but I just think of the story of the young boy who was able, saw him about 7 or 8 years old, and his father had recently died. but his father had come out as being gay, as homosexual, before his death. And the boy basically asked Pope Francis, you know, does this mean my father is going to hell? Is he in hell now? And the response of the Pope was not the doctrine of the church. He asked him if he believed that God created his father. And the boy said yes. And the Pope said yes, because God creates all of us. And he says, I believe God loves all his creations. And I think, you know, he can't come out and say some of these things directly because there would be this upheaval, and quite honestly, he would be gone. Okay? Think about what's happened to some previous popes who tried to make changes quickly. So I think he is working to make some changes, and you know, time will tell. I don't know, he's quite elderly, but that's basically what I have to say about Pope Francis.
Well, I'd like to leave you with some information tonight, and you're not going to remember everything that we're going to put up on the screen, but you can find all of these folks one way or the other online. Kevin, if maybe we can plug in here to what I've got. Of course, John Fetzer, The Quest for a New Age is the book that Brian Wilson has just written, and the Fetzer Institute is sharing this and disseminating this through the country, or throughout the country. And you can contact Brian Wilson at Brian C. Wilson, Brian Wilson at wmich.edu. You can request a free book. Go to tinyurl.com/FetzerBook. And to learn more, simply go to fetzertrust.org. Dr. Kathy Callahan joining us tonight. She's written a number of books. There are 2 of them on the screen. You can write to her at KALYNKARA@hotmail.com, or simply go to Facebook, Edgar Cayce Oahu. Doesn't that sound lovely? And there you go. Contact author Kathy Callahan and Mitch Horowitz for all things Mitch. It's simple. Go to mitchhorowitz.com. Once again, I'd like to thank Brian Wilson, Dr. Callahan, Mitch Horowitz. Great group tonight. Thank you, folks. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Great meeting you both.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate
That was
it.
great. Thank you.
It's fun.